Hello, hello. This is Zaide bringing you another episode of DramaQuest. So today's episode is going to be a little bit different than our last few. For me, it's a busy week because we have a expansion launch coming out later this week, and that means me and most of the people that I play EverQuest with, which again is most of the people that we would interview, are busy. So rather than do another server, which would either be Lockjaw or Ragefire, we're going to do a quick addendum, and then we're going to do probably like a small rant for DramaQuest. Now, the addendum is going to be just adding some additional content for the Fippy and Vulak history episodes. Because I had people reach out, once they hear the episode and they want to add more details or correct some minor discrepancies. And since we are sort of doing like a history here, I think that there is value in making sure we take the time to acknowledge those things and add them. So with that said, we'll start with some of the Phippy stuff, then we'll do a little bit of Vulak discussion, and then we'll go into my rant, which is going to be on what I call the drama tax. So Lucerin, aka Dark Rend from the Ion and Citizen days of Phippy, hit me up with some additional notes and details from his time on the Phippy server. You guys will remember that Dark Rend was the guy who famously lost to Zaide in that duel for like Avatar of War rights, and we'll cover that here. But he wanted to let us know that Phippy Detective was a player known as Rimadol. Rimadol is pretty notable on Phippy. These are my own thoughts here, by the way. He was big on the forum scene, on the Phippy forums. He was a well-known member of Citizen, and he was pretty well known for having what I guess would call is like terrible takes. Now, I like the guy, and he's a Twitch streamer now, and he streams content on the Alcabor server that I think is really good, and he seems like a nice dude, but he has some of the dumbest takes back on the Phippy forums. I remember he used to post incessantly about how the completion of Valia's content, specifically clearing Sleeper's Tomb by Twisted Legion on Phippy, didn't count, and they should all be suspended and stuff because there was, quote, no legitimate way to access Jalad Dar's Shade, which meant you could not turn in any of your Sleeper's Tomb keys, and you couldn't thus access Sleeper's Tomb. Of course, this was because on Phippy, for some reason early on, Zlandikar was not spawning at all. So players couldn't access land. And technically, all appropriate ways to access Jalad Dar's Shade involve getting a key that you either get from turning something into Jalad Dar's Shade or to Zlandikar or killing Zlandikar. One or the other has to happen. And since he never spawned, that couldn't be done. So no one could appropriately enter Jalad Dar's room to turn in their keys to then get access to Sleeper's Tomb. But of course, everyone has known, basically for like 20 years, that you could just run around the back of Jalad Dar's tomb and run up like a little invisible wall and then levitate down into his area and then do all your stuff that way. So that's what they did. And he advocated that it didn't count, blah, 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 which was just kind of ludicrous. And then I think he did a similar thing. He really bought into like the Kool-Aid drinking of Citizen winning Luckland because they got the first Kadishah kill, and Kadishah was, quote, the real boss of Luckland, which I don't think anyone takes seriously either. So the other thing was that there was a rebuttal account. Someone else made a Phippy Detective style account, and they looked for Citizen people warping. And I think the only person notable that they got was War Power on his Cleric. And those got posted around, but I don't think the videos still exist. Now, during the episode, we called Ion United, but it was actually called Immortals of Norath, which was just abbreviated to Ion. The reason we were thinking Ion United was because on either Ragefire or Lockjaw, the guild would resurface. And because, again, globally unique guild names, they were then called Ion United instead of Immortals of Norath. So next we're going to talk about how Dark Rend recounts his duel with Zaide. I'm just going to go verbatim what he says. It's crazy to try to remember it, but it wasn't a short duel. It started slow from what I remember. The GM called that it was going to be a duel, and Zaide was announced as their champion. I hear Dima call my name. I'm shitting bricks. I don't know what I'm doing. The trade window starts opening up. I got handed all these upgrades from people because Sazabi, not just being the better Shadow Knight, was significantly better geared. It felt like it started quickly after that. We were GM dispelled, and it just began. I was being coached in Vent. I had so little PvP experience, pretty much zero. I'm jousting, and during the first pass, I realize attack won't work. A couple more passes, and I'm actively freaking out in Vent, but thankfully, not much HP has been exchanged. Mabu yells at me, "Hacks, bro." I shut them off, and then auto attack stops automatically shutting off. Thank God. I started landing some hits. We were going back and forth on HP chunks. We probably did 10 or so more passes at each other, and then Sazabi just stops moving. I'm like, what is he doing? I look at my HP and I'm at half. I don't have spell effects on, and I didn't even catch he started to just tap burn me down until he was way too far ahead. I dropped so quickly comparatively to the jousting phase, and it was over in like a minute from that point. What a crazy amount of pressure to feel during that. I learned afterwards just how good Sazabi actually was as a player. But he was a friendly guy to me, and I'd always say hi to him when I saw him on different servers. Then, he talks more about how the externally it looked like there was not much negative morale for Citizen, but internally the morale hits were really hard. And, people had a hard time spending so many hours poop socking mobs and trying to raid just to get nothing. But, they managed to keep that morale to where it at least needed to be to survive just by doing things like that Kadi Shah claim and other shenanigans like that. A lot of times I say personally that, being a guild leader is basically like being full-time propaganda. Like you have to constantly find a reason to keep your folks motivated, whether that's like shooting for the fastest clears ever or picking a rival and making them think that that rival is going to beat them so they go hard. And then when it's all said and done, either you win or you lose. But if you lose, you still need to find a win in there somewhere. You can't just go home and say, hey, we lost. It was a total blowout. Nothing good came of this. You always have to find something positive to bring to the guild to keep people coming back, because no one wants to come and just feel bad, right? It's a video game. They want to have fun. And so those little things like saying you got the first Kadi Shah and that's the real boss, that's the same thing. On Mischief, when I formed Faceless the second time, because there was like a civil war of Faceless on Mischief. In Luckland, we were still a really small guild. And I made a big deal about us being the first guild to clear all the raid bosses. Even though we didn't get the server first Adenha Ra, we got the second one. We were the first guild to kill all the big raid mobs, including Kadi Shah. Notably, I think that was the one that the other guild hadn't killed. And I posted that, around a lot. And it was, that kind of thing is just propaganda. You use it, one, to attract recruits, and two, to keep morale up in the guild. Because, even if people sort of know it's bullshit, people just, tend to believe what they want to believe. And so if it benefits their ego to believe that sort of propaganda, they will. Let's see. Apparently, talking about Ion, there were three notable leaders, which were War Power, Roland, and then of course Dark Rend. They had some personal stuff going on in Kunark that came to a head like 30 days prior to Velius, and they were going to make a decision on who to pass the reins to temporarily. Roland was the raid leader. He knew more about EQ than Dark Rend did, and was more active. But he wasn't too great with presenting ideas or being a people person. It made it a tough call. But War Power ultimately chose Dark Rend. And so Ion, already struggling to get any kind of scraps in Kunark and Classic, as they were going into Velius, they started talking to Citizen and stuff. Eventually, they would get merged, and that's sort of the story in a nutshell. The big thing was that Citizen desperately needed clerics at that time, and Ion had like 5 main clerics with high raid attendance. So that was a big factor. Remember, In the Kunark and Classic eras, you almost didn't need traditional guild rosters because Shadow Knights could kill everything, and you could kind of get by on that with just like Shadow Knights and Mages and a smattering of other required classes. But staring down the barrel of Velius, Shadow Knights and Mages basically became useless immediately, and you suddenly needed like real tanks and a heal team. So they discussed things. They had the merge, and part of that merge was that Darkus came over, or sorry, not Darkus, Dark Ren came over as an officer. Everything else that we talked about during that episode remains pretty much the same, and I don't have a lot to add there. But now we'll pop over to the Vulak server and add some content here. So I talked about how a Gornair kill was kind of like the thing that broke the straw that broke the camel's back for me and caused me to be like, what am I doing here? But I remembered later that it was actually totally different. I mean, that Gornair was a real thing, but what really broke it for me was when servers went down and they came back up, certain mobs would either be up or their window would reset or their window would be unaffected. Trackanon was a mob whose window would reset, and it wasn't his normal window, which was, I think, like 12 hours. It was a longer window, I think, of 16 or 20 hours. So it was a more brutal sock if you were going to poop sock it or even just track it than normal. Now, this one particular weekend, I had a girlfriend who was I in high school? I don't know. She was in college though, so I had to drive to see her, and it was a 3-hour drive. I went to go see her. Now, of course, like any good guild leader who had no life back then, I brought my laptop, my gaming laptop, but I didn't expect to really use it. Anyway, I get there, and the day I get there, the servers go down, and Trackanon enters his 20-hour window. And so for me, it became, oh no, like now I have to do this poop sock because Trackanon was the biggest deal. So I led the sock for, I think it was a long one. It was like 16 or 18 hours, almost the full duration. And of course, we lost that Trackanon. And afterwards, I was like, man, I just like wasted, I don't know, half of like the waking time that I had with my girlfriend. She's like obviously super mad at me, and I'm pretty disappointed. And I really gained nothing for it. And that's when I was like, I just can't do this anymore. This is like totally crazy. And that was what started my time of deciding to get off of Vulak. And then I would go on to test. I started a progression guild on test with self-enforced progression, doing level locks, the whole 9 yards, as close to TLP as we possibly could. And in some cases, being slightly more strict. Like we didn't let Shadow Knights use Harm Touch for Classic and Kunark because it was overpowered. We made monks use weapons because back then we felt like their fists were overpowered. So that's what we did. And I remember there being a lot of salt that we were doing that. Like people in EOE at the time used to talk a lot of trash. They wanted us to lose and not have an escape vector. You know what I mean? But we still went on and we cleared content, and we stayed on test clearing content until Lockjaw came out, and we moved to Lockjaw, and the rest, as they say, is history. But there was one other thing I wanted to talk about on Vulak, which is that, while I was competing with EOE, they were also my first experience, like really contending with a top guild of any sort. And in fact, I should mention this. They had Krugen in their guild. For people who don't know who Krugen is, he was kind of a famous paladin from actual Fires of Heaven back in the day. And on Vulak, he played a monk. And I remember when I was a kid, we're talking like 9 years old, 10 years old, I used to read the FOH forums and the news updates and everything, and for both FOH, Afterlife, and Legacy of Steel. Those were my big websites. And these guys were like comic book characters to me. You know what I mean? Like I read that. It was the same as reading like a Captain America comic. Just seeing all these things in the game that were super cool that as a kid, I really didn't have the space to access. And I remembered Krugen because I played a paladin for a long time back then. And it was so crazy seeing him on the server and being like, I recognize that name. Oh my gosh, it's that guy. And he was a monk, and so funny. He was in EOE and he was training me. And I'm like, Jesus, like one of these guys that I used to think was so cool is like in front of me right now. And he's just fucking dropping like jugs on me. Wild. So never meet your heroes, I guess. But when EOE cleared Vishan's Peak, they made a big deal about it being the fastest and lowest numbered VP cleared ever for a server first. And I thought it was super cool, and I was really, really envious of it. And they went on to be super focused on clearing things fast as possible, because Vulak launched after Phippy did, and they wanted to catch up to the Phippy server or even pass them. They wanted their server to win. And so for that reason, there was this huge push to be as fast as you possibly could in EOE to make up for that time loss. The math is really weird on how that worked because of the voting rules, and like voting and expansions only opened up on certain days. So even though they were only like 2 days apart on server launches, it became like a week apart that bridge had to be, that gap had to be bridged. Anyway, seeing that, that glory of like that fast clear is kind of what set me on the path of later caring about how fast everything was. In the time between that server and Lockjaw launch, I went and I looked at how fast all the previous progression guilds had done all their server firsts. And whenever you couldn't get an exact time because there wasn't a log or whatever available, I would just assume the fastest, right? So like if the expansion launched on this day and they killed it on this day, I would assume they killed it at like midnight 01. You know what I mean? Like as soon as it hit that day. And I set all those benchmarks for like the fastest times ever. And kind of carrying directly on from that old EOE post, I set about the goal of beating them. And for I think Classic through Luckland, we did. I never did Pop back in those days. I would always quit before Pop. And I just really didn't like Pop content. But yeah, we did all those, not just the expansions, but also in Classic, like the fastest Vox, the fastest Nagafin. And of course, this will come up more in like the Agnar and Lockjaw episodes. But I just wanted to kind of give insight into where that comes from and why I originally, got into that line of thinking. The other part about that is that it makes for great propaganda, like we talked about earlier. I don't really, and I would say I never really, really cared about the fastest times ever. Like it was something cool. But the most important thing is a recruitment tactic. There are many top guilds, and there are many guilds that aspire to be top guilds. Most of the time, TLPs, there are 2 different servers, and people have to choose which server, choose which guild to go in. Top guilds look very similar from the outside frequently. So you have to find something to set yourself apart. And the 2 things that I wanted to pick were like not being incredibly toxic and being faster than the other guilds on like the pure time trial sense. And I think it was super effective. It's something that people still talk about, even though I don't really talk about it too much in the last couple of years. It still comes up pretty frequently, and I think it attracted a lot of people and a lot of top talent to Faceless over the years. So, in that regard, the propaganda of it was very effective. All right, so now with the addendum of Fippy and Vulak behind us, let's go ahead and take some time to talk about the drama tax. So for people who don't know what I'm talking about here, the drama tax is the tax that you pay to keep certain players around. Now, EverQuest is an easy game, almost bottom to top, classic to retail. It's pretty dang easy. There's a few encounters here and there which are a little bit challenging, but it's never very challenging. It never demands supremely skilled players. But we lose sight of that, especially when you have competition. When you have competition, your goal is always to crush them no matter what. And as a guild leader, you're always going to think in the back of your head, if I kick this person because they're causing a ton of drama, or they're really fucking annoying, or they just drain the energy out of you every day, you know that if you kick them, they're probably going to join your competition and make them stronger, which is about the worst thing that could happen. So a lot of times, guilds just sit there with these toxic players, and they deal with them day and night. And you see guild leaders and officer teams burn out. Sometimes whole guilds dissolve just because of a few toxic people. And the thing about toxic people is they love to spread it. They love to like form little side discords, form little cliques, and they'll complain about things. You take some people who are susceptible to that, right? Who like you have a bad raid, and then you have this side discord, and people just talk about it, and they poke at it, and they poke at it, and they poke at it, and suddenly like a raid where a particular tank died 3 times becomes this earth-shattering event. And you're like, dude, it's just like, first, you're a tank, your job's pretty much to die, so who cares? Shut up. But it becomes this thing that people just kind of like talk in circles and get themselves all spun up about. And the drama tax is basically that. It's basically like there are talented players who can be trash in terms of their behavior and their personality. And you pay the tax of dealing with that to retain them because of their talent and because you don't want them to go to the competition. And, on Mischief, I have kind of taken a different approach. I have to remind myself to do this, but I'll sit myself down and I'll be like, okay, this person is driving me up the wall. They're in my DMs all the time. I have to deal with shit about them or because of them. And I just do it for weeks and weeks and weeks. And it is super stressful because it just sucks the life and the fun out of the experience. And usually the people who do this are pretty dang talented EverQuest players. It just works out that way. And now, not every talented person creates drama. In fact, most people don't. And not every person who creates drama and does this shit is talented. But there's a lot of people who are in that Venn diagram, in that spot where they're very good and they cannot shut the fuck up about what's bothering them. So you deal with these kind of people all the time. And I had to start doing it on Mischief. I just say, hey, man, like the most important quality in a player is someone who's positive, follows instructions, and can shut their mouth sometimes because the content is not hard. And the biggest thing I've had to deal with as a guild leader is like people who think that they're too good to play with other players, or they're too good to play with a certain raid leader, or they're pissed off because their class is not just perfectly optimized. Like that, they're a berserker and they don't have a bard and a shaman and a monk and a rogue in their group every single time. And it's like, listen, there are like 6,000 monks on any given server because it's like the flavor of the year class. It's OP in the early eras. Everybody knows it. So there's like 1,000 of them. Shaman is one of the rarer classes because it's tough to play. It's not challenging, but it's a pain in the ass. There's a lot to do, very involved, and you get like basically no glory for all the hard work you do. And so it just works out that not every single melee can be the prima donna, can have that shaman bard in their group. You know what I mean? No matter what you do, unless you box them, you are not guaranteed to have them all the time. And I think it's like fair to be kind of equitable about it. I try to ensure that there's no one who never had the perfect group. You try to spread the love, so to speak. Now, the people who have higher uptime, who are better players and are a little bit more Johnny on the spot, you tend to favor them when you're forming those groups because it creates a more optimal result for the raid. But every now and then, they have to get on ice and they have to not have that perfect group because even the people who aren't the best deserve to have optimal ADPS. And boy, do you find out who you're paying that drama tax on whenever that happened. I had a guy come crying to me about not having a bard in his group. He's like telling me about how he like avoided this on-call job he had to do that could have made him $200, and then he came to the raid and then he didn't even have a bard in his group. And I was like, dude, you're being such a little bitch right now. And I actually took him and I walked through every raid for like the last 6 months. And he had like 3 times where he didn't have a bard. And then he's like, yeah, I think I'm going to take a break. And I was like, just don't come back. You know what I mean? Don't come back. It's not worth dealing with. And I'm always nervous about that. I'm always nervous. Like, man, am I making the right decision? The right decision when I, kick these people? And a few days after, I always feel like I did make the right choice. because it's just so much better. Like the environment is so much better. I can't tell you how good it feels to come out of work or even shit to wake up and not have someone crying in my DMs, crying about something, crying because they think some other monk is not good enough to be in the guild and we should kick them. Or they think their group wasn't perfect, or their shaman and their bard didn't sync their epics close enough. I mean, like, that shit is so far below the level that needs my attention. You know what I mean? Like, just talk to people in your group. If you see someone who's not performing well, try to encourage them to perform better. Talk to them about how they can improve. And if they don't, then talk to me maybe. But the bottom line is, like, most guilds are not running 54 people in a raid. And so if that monk has like 300 seconds less uptime, and consequently they have less DPS or less damage done overall throughout the night, that is still they're still doing 2-3 million more damage than an empty raid slot would do, right? And you'll have people who want to split more, split deeper, but then if they wipe, they cry. And part of splitting deep is like sometimes you fucking wipe, you know what I mean? Sometimes if you want to split as deep as you can to get the maximum amount of loot possible, I'm right there. I love that shit. But people need to accept that A, raids are going to be slower when you do that because you have fewer people. And B, you are occasionally going to wipe because you're riding the lightning, right? You're right on the edge. So if you're doing that, you just have to accept those parts of the game. But people just have gotten so used to the TLP experience of steamrolling content that they just cannot handle any kind of loss. People have gotten so sensitive about it. And the other thing is people always look back and they remember their previous guilds, especially their previous TLP guilds. And they're like, man, we wiped more in this guild than we did in that guild. And I know they're wrong. I know they're wrong because half the people who are doing this have only been in guilds that I've run. You know what I mean? Like they're comparing the guild I'm leading right now to the guild I led 5 years ago. And I'm like, bitch, I led both guilds. Like they both wiped occasionally. Shit just happens. But we tend to forget the bad raids unless they're spectacularly bad. But we forget about the kind of mediocre nights. And we just remember the smoothness of the overall experience. Be like, oh yeah, that, we never had a problem. We never had tanks die to Talonzek, or we never had we never had a wipe in Solteris. But you probably did. You're just remembering it wrong. So yeah, man, all that shit just drains you. And then there's other kinds of drama that you have to deal with too, like the people who go out and train people and fight over camps, and they think it just doesn't matter. To them, it doesn't, right? The people who do that tend to be people who quit around Gates of Discord time every server. And if you're a guild on TLP that only does, you're like a re-roller guild, you only do classic through pop or classic through omens, then it really doesn't matter to you because your reputation just doesn't matter. You only play on servers when they're hugely popular, and you have a whole team of re-rollers who will always be there with you. But if you're a guild that's trying to go the distance, a guild that is actually trying to maybe not even just go the distance, but see how far you can go, right? Things get pretty trim later on in the expansions, right? The population dips down pretty significantly. And it's tough. It's really tough on guilds to fight that attrition. And a lot of times you can get screwed because some asshole who quit the guild 2 years ago trained someone for a fungi tunic. You know what I mean? Or train them for a flowing black silk sash, like week 2 of classic. People don't forget about that stuff and they hold it against you. And then you'll have a point where you're like either trying to recruit that person and they'll never join you, or worse, you're trying to absorb a guild and they put their foot down. They're like, I'll never join that guild because they trained me at XY mob 18 months ago. And you'll be like, okay, hey, who trained you? Who was it? I'll talk to them. They're like, oh, it's this guy. And you're like, I don't even fucking know that guy. Like he was in the guild for 2 months, but it just won't change people's opinion about you. And people talk, right? So it's just all around bad PR constantly that you have to deal with. Then you have people who like are late or inconsistent with things. Like right now, I have to deal with this. I deal with it every 3 months, basically. I plan an expansion launch. So for me, like I have my Secrets of Fadeware sign-up sheet here that my guild uses. It's got a Google form that people have to answer questions in. And it's like, hey, what's your character name, your class? What time can you be on? How late can you stay? Do you want to be in this raid or that raid? Do you have these, benchmarks? Like, will you have an EXP potion? Do you have your Force of Nature achievement done? Do you have glyphs banked? All that stuff is asked, and they fill it out. And like, I have 131 responses here, 131. And so then, like for SOF specifically, I have to form groups. Okay, so we have Big Ben and Deep Scar. We have Steam Factory. We have Meldrath's Mansion, and we have Crystallos. All those raids have to be split differently because you want to maximize flags. So you might 4-split Ben and Deep Scar, maybe you 3 or 4-split Steam Factory, then you maybe 2 or 3-split Meldraths, and maybe you just do 1 clear that first week of Crystallos, maybe. But then, based on what raid people are going to stop at, you have to organize EXP groups, right? 6-man teams. And it works best if the people in the 6-man will go to the same distance in the rating progression. So you have to line that up. And to do that, you have to factor in 1, what raid do they want to be in? And 2, how late can they be on? First, if you can't be on at launch time, you're basically immediately out of going the distance, right? Because you won't be fast enough to level or to flag. But that sure doesn't stop people from saying, hey, I want to be in the first raid to clear Crystallos. I'll be on at 9 p.m., like 3 hours late. No, dude, it's not going to work. I'm sorry. Or people who have to like log off at midnight and you're like, hey, man, this is probably going to be like a 12-hour expansion launch. So I need you on until 5 a.m. if you want to go the distance. People will still get salty about that kind of thing. Or worse, people will not fill out the form, even though you mention it 600 times and you do it every expansion. So it should be very common and understood. And, I've talked to these people about it before. It's not like they're new members, because if it's a new member, you understand. But yeah, people will just not fill out the form, or people will fill out the form and then they'll forget if they filled it out. They'll fill it out again and again and again. You got to delete all the duplicates. Or if people will fill it out and then like they won't say anything and they will just not show up. Now, the only way to stop people to try to mitigate that, the people who just fucking sign up and don't show, which is the worst and rudest thing you could possibly do, in my opinion, is you have to individually, like 2 days before the expansion release, message all 131 people who signed up and say, hey, are you still good for what you put, which by the way was this? And they'll say yes or no. And it's crazy to me when people are like, oh yeah, actually I won't be able to play that day. And I'm like, so do you mean to tell me that if I didn't personally come to you and ask you if you were going to show up, you were just going to no call, no show? Or like, when were you going to tell me? Because we've spent a long time planning this. You're one of 130 cogs in this machine here, and you're a critical part. And I have now, luckily, I've got 2 days to figure out what to do with what you were supposed to do in the raid. But it's just crazy to me that like I have to hunt people down, or one of my officers has to hunt people down, because they will not just tell you the moment they know. You know what I mean? Like if I find out I have an engagement that is going to get in the way of another engagement, I immediately try to resolve those 2 things, figure out which one takes precedence, and I just let people know as soon as I can so they have the most time. Now, trust me, I know that shit comes up. Okay, so every now and then there's emergencies, right? Some people literally last minute find out. But God, I have to have done close to 100 expansion launches and server launches since 2011, leading Faceless. It's kind of a joke. It's a meme, in fact, that for some reason there's a spike in the number of mothers who go hospitalized or die the week of an expansion launch, because all these emergencies suddenly come out of the woodwork, and it makes you pretty jaded about the whole thing. And all that stuff, man, is part of that drama tax. Like that is not like an explicit thing where people are making an ass out of themselves, but it's something that just wears on you, that you have to deal with, you have to account for, you've got to manage. It's something that is harder the bigger your guild is, and easier the smaller it is. But the downside of having a smaller guild is people still do it. And when they do it, you could be totally shit out of luck, right? If you got 3 warriors and one of them says, hey, I can't make it, you might not be able to do the expansion with 2 warriors, or if you can, it's going to be an absolute struggle bus. So, yeah, it is just brutal doing these sometimes. Absolutely brutal doing them because so many people are just not good at time management, or the priority just isn't there, right? Like they don't really care and they'll sign up and no show, or they won't even sign up. And then the day of the expansion, they'll be like, "Hey, I noticed I wasn't in a group." And you're like, "Well, groups have been published for a week now, so it'd be cool if you told me that back then. I just assumed since you didn't sign up that you weren't going to be here." And then they're like, "Well, I need a group." And you're like, "Okay, well, let me, put down what I'm doing," which is, by the way, is like running these 72-man raids and help you find your group really quick. And part of leadership, not just guild leadership, but being part of the leadership team, really in any organization, is dealing with that. And even though it is terrible and you're like internally raging, you put on your like customer service face and you try to help those people out. Just because it's like a human factor. And like internally, I make a mental note, like I have to babysit this person in the future, and maybe I'm mad at them, but I do my absolute best to not let them know that it has annoyed me, or that it's a huge distraction. And I try to just help get them where they need to be, because the time that you do flip out on someone will be the time that someone had like the realest reason ever to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. So it's just not worth it. You know what I mean? I always try to remember at the end of the day, no matter how annoying someone is or how mad I am at someone or how draining they are, at the end, it's a video game. They're a real human who is deserving of dignity and respect. And that is part of the drama tax, man. That is part of it. Because you never get to, there's no way to relieve all that drama, all that energy loss and waste. Anyway, so that was the quick addendum to Fippy and Vulak. Just a little bit of additional information there for all of you. Hopefully, we have corrected some inaccuracies or added some relevant details. And that is my rant about the drama tax. Remember, if you are planning to lead a guild, or you're an officer in a guild and you have one of those members who is creating drama, just fucking kick them. Kick them earlier before it exhausts you, because you will burn out. You will absolutely burn out. In Luckland, I had a team of warriors who were all in a little clique in a side Discord that became super toxic. And they just never stopped crying about stuff. And they tried to bully new warriors who joined. And so I told my officers, I was like, "Hey, you four, I need you guys to re-roll warriors and have a max level warrior by next week." They're like, "Okay." And when they did, I kicked the whole little drama squad of warriors, kicked them all. They joined my competition. They said, "Oh, your guild sucks. It's going to die anyway. We're happy to be over here." And 2 expansions later, Faceless was the top guild again and hasn't dropped an expansion since. So just do the thing that is going to provide you longevity in your leadership team. It's not going to drive you crazy. But if it's something like signups and internal nonsense that is not toxicity, it's just irresponsibility, try to show them some compassion. You know what I mean? And recognize that we're all humans. Anyway, that's my episode. Looking forward to hopefully next week getting out either the Ragefire or the Lockjaw episode. By the way, if you played on any of the servers between basically Ragefire and now, and you're interested in being on the show for an interview, let me know. I've got folks lined up for like Agnar, Addendum, Finnegal right now, but I still need Ragefire, Lockjaw, and Cornav. And I wouldn't mind doing a few like multi-episode server histories too, so I can take more than one. But anyway, that's it. DramaQuest over. Zaide out. Thanks.